Before delving in, I just want to take a moment to give a quick thank you for all the responses I've gotten from my last video. I genuinely never expected anyone to watch my content, and whether it be praise or criticism, it's helped put everything into perspective with how I plan on making content in the future. Though I will say it's been reassuring to know that I'm at least getting something right. Seriously, I can't thank you all enough. Now, pertaining to the video, the format very much tends to sway in and out of being a retrospective and a critique. I've done my best to lay out all my points in the most coherent and chronological order possible, but either way I'm going to operate under the assumption that you've already seen the Castlevania series. And I initially intended for this to cover all 4 seasons of the show, but I underestimated how daunting of a task that'd be with my current schedule. Hopefully having this retrospective being broken up into 2 parts is still reflective of the quality of content that currently exists on the channel. However, with all of that now out of the way, let's jump right on in. While this video is a rather mixed bag of praise and criticism, I think it's best to preface all of that by pointing out that I'm admittedly unfamiliar with the Castlevania games. I played a couple of them loosely a long time ago and never delved too heavily into the story content. There's certainly an argument to be made about whether a piece of media is a proper adaptation from its source material, but there's also an argument to be made about whether a piece of media is well written despite being an improper adaptation. And I can only measure the writing quality based on what the Castlevania Netflix series is. Though it's pretty difficult to determine if the whole product of this series is objectively good. The first 2 seasons had a very strong start, but it seems that the creative lead struggled to determine where the story should go after the main Dracula arc. While there is a substantial amount of compelling world building, their decision to crank out the later 2 seasons came at a detriment to not only the overall plot structure, but for other well-established characters. Like many great show and film franchises, Castlevania fell into the near-inevitable pit trap of having to draft up seasons as quickly as possible for profit's sake, limiting the quality and overall potential as to where this series could have gone.
Hello, I like money.
However, as I said earlier, this video is going to be a rather mixed bag, and Season 1 encapsulates that sentiment pretty prominently. Because it's extremely limited with what it's able to portray due to only having 4 episodes, Season 1 has to set the stage rather quickly. In the first few minutes, we're introduced to Lisa, a local townswoman from Lupu in pursuit of studying medicine. And during her whole exchange with Dracula, we discover that she's willing to learn how to properly treat people, even if it's at the expense of being ostracized for it. It's a commendable quality about Lisa's character that's established early on, all while conveying what this region's overall sentiment towards the utility science offers. On the offhand, though, we're dealing with Dracula Tepesh here. As an immortal being who requires blood for survival, his value on human life would be substantially lower than what Lisa holds it to. One would think it would take a fair amount to sway him into granting a mortal access to his library.
What have you to trade for my knowledge? I've known you 2 minutes, and you offer for me to walk the earth, while I give you the knowledge of immortals. The true science.
That's a pretty fair point. For some reason, Lisa never takes into consideration that Dracula has been alive for thousands of years and has more than likely seen everything there is to see regardless of the method that he uses. There needs to be a compelling reason as to why this immortal being should consider the insight a human has to offer him, but instead it's substituted with expository charisma.
Maybe I can teach you to like people again. Or at least tolerate them. They won't be peasants anymore if you teach them. Start with me. And I'll start with you.
I think I might like you.
Everything is wrong.
And none of this is supported by Dracula refusing to recognize the ramifications involved with allowing a human to access his library. What sort of damage and terror could mankind potentially inflict by utilizing the immense amount of information he currently holds? It's a bit strange that there's no precedent for something like this potentially being an issue in the present. But unfortunately, all of that is brushed aside in order to establish their relationship in the plot, because it's absolutely vital for everything else that is to follow. And while nothing about this initial interaction is inherently flawed conceptually, there needed to be some form of resistance between the two of them before having this plot point resolve. It only makes sense for a character like Dracula to be incredibly hesitant to the prospect of change, but Lisa's persistence and appeal to him to place value in humanity's plight would be the catalyst to develop their relationship. Instead of ham-fisting all these concepts through expository dialogue, conveying them throughout an extended period of time would allow viewers to attach some form of investment to Lisa as a character, and certainly give her death a lot more weight. Though it's effectively set up straight out of the gate, only to be immediately taken away within the next scene, with Dracula enacting his revenge soon afterwards. And while this entire string of rushed events doesn't completely shatter the core premise of the show, it does hinder any potential deeper characterization between the two of them. In contrast, the character development for Trevor is pretty solid. With the Belmont family accused of practicing black magic, having been excommunicated from the church and all their belongings razed, he's become jaded to the prospect of helping others. He'd rather spend his days getting drunk and watching the world burn for the actions inflicted upon his family. But it's important to note, despite all that, he doesn't actively seek conflict with others. In fact, before the build-up to the bar fight scene, he's willing to drop what he wants most in order to de-escalate the situation.
Forget it. I'll just go.
Now, you're a Belmont. This is all your fault.
It's a subtle way of displaying an underlying moral component to his character, that even though he may hold disdain for the people of Wallachia for betraying his family, he has no desire of creating or instigating conflict. However, this fight also beautifully illustrates the flaws of our main protag. His extensive training and experience with beast hunting can only cover a certain range. Trevor is still human, and oftentimes doesn't walk away from brawls scratch-free. In a current age of media where it's almost a guarantee that your main protagonists are going to be coated in plot armor, it's refreshing that shows like Castlevania stray from the current norm. And that's not to say that plot armor doesn't rear its ugly head throughout the series from time to time, but there's something to be said about the fact that the writing doesn't overly rely on it. At least for the first 2 seasons, anyway. Speaking of which, the pinnacle of Trevor's character work in Season 1 and where a majority of the plot unfolds is in the town of Gresit. Initially stumbling along in the simple pursuit of a meal, his interactions with the remaining townspeople reinforces his preconceptions and indifference towards their suffering, that they effectively choose to support the religious power structure that brought their utter demise, all while clinging to folklore or superstition.
The bishop will sort things out. This city has, not to put too fine a point on it, gone to hell. There's an old story, the sleeping soldier. They say he was a great hero hundreds of years ago, and now he sleeps under the catacombs.
I think the speakers make the sleeping soldier ill. We have no defenses.
For evil bastards to win power, all ordinary people have to do is stand aside and keep quiet.
Though, as he's fixing to pass on to the next town, Trevor witnesses an elderly speaker getting threatened by a couple of priests. In typical fashion, the church has to have a scapegoat in order to maintain their power base, loosely claiming that the speaker's practice of black magic is what's drawing the night creature raids upon Gresit. It's certainly not a wildly profound plot point, but based on what's already been established about their orders so far, it makes sense that they'd resort to such a drastic measure, which causes an inner conflict to take place in Trevor. Normally, his pragmatic desire to wave away confrontation would have stronger influence here, but he knows that the speakers don't fall in line with his moral assertions that he ascribes to the townspeople. In many ways, this scene is the beginning of his worldview being challenged by the very people he went out of his way to protect. But it doesn't come without any expense. Despite wanting to de-escalate the situation, his lack of self-control is further testament to one of his many flaws, and it properly lays the groundwork for future confrontation going forward. However, whenever the two of them reach the group's lodging, we're given a moment to discover the history between the speakers and Trevor's family, how the speakers operate as an order, and how dedicated this group is to enacting humanitarian efforts.
My family's always been on good terms with speakers, although my father once got into a fight with one.
I told you it was too soon to go outdoors. And I told you it was necessary to offer aid to the people. We are quite protective of our ways. History is a living thing. Paper is dead.
And while the dialogue can be a bit too direct for my liking, it does contribute something of substance to the overall universe that this series is attempting to craft, and also allows room for a clash of differing philosophies.
If you know speakers, then you know we can't turn away from those in need.
For evil bastards to win power, all ordinary people have to do is stand aside and keep quiet.
These two ideologies help shape why the both of them effectively have to reach some form of compromise. The Elder has a strong desire to remain in Gresit to help the city recover, but is also heavily dependent on Trevor to help find his grandchild's body. And Trevor's personal experiences shape his moral reasonings as to why he's willing to perform such an arduous task for the speakers. Having to watch the destruction of his family's legacy nearly destroyed him, and doesn't want others to suffer that same fate. Which properly leads us to Trevor journeying down into the catacombs for their missing speaker. During his search, he ends up stumbling upon a Cyclops guarding the crypt, ultimately putting Trevor in a desperate struggle for his life. And there are a lot of components to really appreciate with this fight. It widens the variety and scale of the types of monsters that can exist in this world, all while coherently explaining the mechanics of the fight through beautifully crafted visuals. and providing us a glimpse of Trevor's resourcefulness, to be able to exploit those said mechanics and the information he knows about Cyclopses in order to gain the advantage. It's arguably the highlight of Season 1, if not the entire series, because not only is this encounter such an incredibly well-constructed fight sequence, but it adds another layer to the overall world building, while simultaneously introducing us to a new main player in the plot, Sypha Belnatus. Her place in the story doesn't seem drastically important initially, but whenever they return to the lodge, she's one of the main driving voices for the speakers to remain in Gresit, once again laying out another instance of Trevor's worldview being challenged by the very people he went out of his way to protect.
By his logic, you have to die before the night creatures conduct their next raid.
I don't think we can leave these people. Not in their time of need.
These people believe you're causing their time of need.
It's time for those of us who fight that war to stand up and be responsible, Trevor Belmont.
And his decision he makes later on to protect the speakers from harm's way, along with the rest of the townspeople from impending slaughter, is the peak of his overall arc in this season. But it's pretty difficult to ignore how bizarre the priest's order to wait until nearly nightfall before organizing the mob to kill the speakers is.
Dracula's monsters come at night, but the bishop's men come in the middle of the day.
There's hardly any daylight left during this scene. You'd think a fair number of the townspeople would break off and barricade themselves indoors in preparation for the night creature raids, regardless of their beliefs. It's a pretty heavy break in terms of consistency. The writers needed to have a large group of townspeople out in the open during the next raid so that Trevor can have a moment to appeal to have them work against the clergy and protect the town. But this mob's decision to wait until the last possible minute is incongruent with the immense threat night creatures impose on Gresit, and how unequipped the townspeople are to defend themselves without Trevor's help. Not to mention that the church could have enacted this execution at any point during the day, but decided to wait until the 11th hour because... reasons, I guess. However, the fight sequence that follows shortly afterward is executed pretty well. It's structured, conveys what night creatures are vulnerable to, and prominently highlights everyone's skill sets. Trevor's resourcefulness and knowledge with killing Dracula's demons is put on full display, emphasizing ever further why the Belmonts were such renowned beast hunters. And it puts into perspective how worse off Wallachia would have been if the church had completely wiped out all of the Belmonts. Who knows, if Trevor's family hadn't been deposed, they could have very well protected a good amount of the country from Dracula's initial onslaught. It's pretty damn good storytelling. Castlevania often presents the viewer with very detailed and well-structured scenes that have you consider the impact it has on Wallachia, if not the entire world at times, and how it shapes other characters. And this sequence is yet another moment of Castlevania at its finest. Which is why it's so disjointing when the story immediately pivots from some of the best writing it has to offer to some of the worst. I have to say, it's convenient as hell that a good portion of the city ended up being built above a massive cavern. Convenient as hell that the rest of the city didn't end up caving in on them, despite all of it being held up by a thin layer of stone. Convenient as hell that the both of our protags fell down the one hole, which led them directly to the exact person best equipped to help them take out Dracula.
See, now that's some bullshit.
I'm aware that there's only so much time left to introduce Alucard into the plot, but the level of contrivance that led up to all of this is a bit insane and downright lazy. Surely there are better ways of incorporating a vital character like Alucard into the story without practically teleporting our other protags to precisely where the script needs them to be. However, the overall interaction between the three of them holds up fairly well. It only makes sense that Alucard would test Trevor to see if he truly amounts to the weight of his family name, or if he's just some aspiring nobody wearing a crest. And after recognizing how evenly matched the two of them are, along with discovering that Sypha is a speaker magician, he proposes that the three of them should help take down Dracula, setting the stage for the events of Season 2. And it's here where the writing elements for Castlevania shine at its brightest. With 8 episodes, there's less of a time constraint to properly develop and explore certain characters. There's enough breathing room in the script to where the plot isn't forcing relationships and conflict to happen. It's why the backstory that's dedicated to Isaac and Hector towards the start of Season 2 is such a welcome change of pace. Their characterization and presence in the plot provides a great deal of context and insight as to why Dracula holds them to be the fringe exception rather than the set rule for mankind, how vital of a role forging night creatures plays in his crazed mission, and just how disjointed the court is. Not all of the main contributors are driven to execute Dracula's orders out of respect for his personal tragedy. Many of them have ulterior motives and tend to disagree with the lengths of how far this mission should be carried out. And these sections really emphasize the contrast between Dracula's perspective in comparison to the rest of the vampire world.
The only two humans in your inner court, and they are the ones who will plan our next attack.
You married, you had a child, and yet you did not make her a vampire. Were you simply keeping a human pet? And if so, why is vampire society going to war with the world over it?
In most series and films, characters that fall under this archetype typically never receive this level of thought and development. While Godbrand, Carmilla, Hector, and Isaac are all certainly lower in the hierarchy of Dracula's court, they're all still well-crafted characters with dedicated aspirations, fears, weaknesses, and desires. That's not to say that all of this material is perfect. In fact, there are a lot of developments that take place in the plot that you would think would catch Dracula's immediate attention and involvement. However, we'll have to put a pin in that topic since it will become a lot more relevant later on in the video. Now, while the emphasis of the plot material seems to be focused on the inner workings of Dracula's operation, the characterization dedicated to Trevor, Sypha, and Alucard's storyline is far from insignificant. The three of them seeking out the Belmont Hold in order to find the best means of taking out Dracula is not only something that falls in line with their respective characters, but its sheer existence holds a tremendous amount of weight from a world-building standpoint, and their time spent within it shapes all of their individual perspectives in a really meaningful way. Particularly in Sypha's case. Rather than being predominantly a plot device for Trevor to go recover, she's a lot more fleshed out in this season. After parting ways with her orders, Sypha is left with the growing uncertainty of potentially being on her own, and what it implies for the people she loves most, but ultimately comes to understand the gravity of what's at stake. Though we're also given some context about the nature of her studies. Her ability to open the Belmont Hold door later on paints a clearer picture as to not only the type of information she's privy to, but what the speakers possess as a whole. And her time spent searching through all the records in the Belmont Library challenges her assertions as to how information should be recorded.
Look at this. There's more in this room than a million speakers could carry across 2 generations.
Though in Alucard's eyes, the Belmont Hold has a much more sinister connotation associated with it. It's a repository of death, a withered museum dedicated to hunting down his own kind. He exists within 2 worlds and doesn't want to see the other completely destroyed. As he's pointed out during their travels, Dracula and vampires as a whole tend to carry vast amounts of knowledge with them, and there's an enormity tied to killing one. And even though all 3 of them are united in their mission to stopping Dracula, it's this staunch divide between perspectives that leads Sypha to bonding more with Trevor. And of course to Trevor, the Hold is a relict memory of a life that he can never truly get back. His family home burned down to a state of utter disrepair, left only with the reminder of what could have been, stumbling around in search of dusty heirlooms, anything that can be of use. I think moments like these is what Season 1 was drastically missing. The Belmont Hold doesn't just exist in service of the plot, it's an outlet to properly understand these characters and to see them develop in a believable fashion. There's a lot that can be pulled from this world in relation to the people that exist in it, and Season 2 of Castlevania does an excellent job of making that abundantly clear. There's certainly a lot to praise with this installment of this series in general, but that's not to say that it's void of any flaws. Nothing that drastically breaks the overall world building or plot, mind you, but there are some very questionable moments that tend to pop up from time to time. The most notable example being whenever Isaac reveals to the court that Alucard is working with a Belmont.
We believe our Lord's son Alucard and the Belmont may have worked together to repel our forces at Gresit.
It's a bit strange that Dracula never chimes in on this whole revelation. Not only is the last remaining descendant of the Belmonts, who have a long history of hunting vampires, attempting to stop him from eradicating the human race, but that his own son is actively helping Trevor. This seems like an incredibly relevant piece of information that he'd surely act on in some capacity, or at the very least have a conversation with Hector and Isaac over. I fail to see why he wouldn't have immediately ordered a group of night creatures to go raid the Belmont Hold upon discovering all this. Would Carmilla have still found a way to plant the seeds of doubt in Hector to ultimately betray Dracula? More than likely, but it surely would have made the whole process a lot more difficult. Speaking of which, whenever Carmilla eventually goes to enact her plan to depose Dracula and the rest of the court, she has Hector turn the bishop from Season 1 into a night creature and turn the river in Brela into holy water. Question. Isn't it a little paradoxical that a priest who is sent to hell and then resurrected as a night creature is able to create holy water? Maybe I'm just being pedantic here, but it's kind of strange that a night creature is able to create the very thing that it's most vulnerable to. Regardless, the final act lays out a beautifully constructed fight sequence that establishes unique sets of obstacles for all three of our protags to overcome with each vampire general they encounter, creating a steady progression before getting the opportunity to face Dracula. Their ability to coordinate and chain attacks off one another is conveyed in a really aesthetically pleasing way, highlighting why the three of them banding together in the first place was so pertinent. Rather than being individual agents mindlessly tearing through enemies, they're all dependent on each other's skill sets. But while all the chaos breaking out in the main chamber is going on, we have an interesting exchange between Isaac and his master.
You would give your mortal life to preserve my immortal one?
I choose my death, as I chose my life.
It's a clever way of calling back to Isaac's uncertainty about how much use loyalty serves the devoted.
Perhaps this is all loyalty buys. Death on your master's floor.
But Isaac's willingness to sacrifice his mortal life to preserve his immortal one catches Dracula off guard, causing him to a certain extent to see the value a human life can possess, and he decides to reward Isaac's loyalty by sparing him an otherwise gruesome death. Speaking of which, the final climax between Alucard and Dracula initially starts off as a brutal conflict which gradually eases into a state of clarity. That killing off his son in the pursuit of avenging his wife's death would undermine the greatest gift that she ever gave him, with both of them ultimately coming to terms with what needs to be done, and we're shown the extent of what it takes to fully realize it. In that moment, we once again see on Alucard's face the enormity of the sacrifice he has to make. In order to save humanity, he has to destroy the last semblance of the family he has left. He's made lifelong friends out of Trevor and Sypha along the way, all while being entrusted with the Belmont family legacy, but Alucard is effectively burdened with tending to the aftermath of his completely shattered life. Not everyone in this story is able to walk away unscathed. There's a tremendous amount of weight to the choices that Alucard carries out in the plot, and all of it has a long-lasting impact on his character. But the outcomes of all the hardship he's had to endure to this point should ultimately be final, along with Dracula's significance in the Castlevania series, because the lengths the three of them take to ensure Dracula's death doesn't hold as much meaning as it could if none of it is absolute. Though I'll be addressing that topic in length in my second part of this retrospective series. With that said, if you've managed to make it this far in the video, then thank you all for watching. Hopefully these pieces will be more comprehensive and take less time to produce in the future. However, if you want to find more regular updates with projects I'm currently working on, or just simply want to chat, then feel free to join the Discord server. Link is in the description. Again, thanks for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.